a 3-week sermon series titled Going Places, and I'm going to start with something that is real, a real story about a real person. I'm going to call this person Peter, but that's not his name. Peter is a young father. I met him last year. He was never supposed to be a father because he and his wife were told they can't have kids, and so when they had a baby girl, it was kind of like a miracle baby. Life was good. But then something started to go wrong, and they took the baby girl to the doctor. And then the doctor sent them to Riley Hospital, which is where I met them. For last year, I was serving as a hospital chaplain there. And I got to know this family, and I spent a bunch of time with them right around this time last year. I spent the last few months of this little girl's life with the family. And I can feel my emotions welling up just talking about it right here. It was one of the most difficult things that I did professionally. And how difficult it was for me was way easier than it was for this young father, Peter, and his wife. Which is why it was so surprising several months later when I returned to Riley Hospital to serve now as a fill-in chaplain that I heard word that Peter was coming back to the hospital, this time with a high school choir that he was the director of. They were going to sing Christmas carols down in the lobby of Riley next to the big Christmas tree, so I carved out time in my afternoon because I was not going to miss that. I'm so glad that I didn't. It was beautiful. And afterwards, I talked with Peter about how is it that you're able to come back to this place where you experienced some of the darkest, most painful moments of your life, and you're back here leading the choir to sing. Peter started to talk to me about his relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, I knew Peter had faith because we prayed together, but he talked about his faith and how he had been praying as a way to help cope and mourn the loss of his little girl, his miracle child. And then as he prayed time and time again, he started to get the idea, to receive the direction that he should take that choir that he was investing himself in and bring it over to Riley Hospital and have them sing and bring light into the darkness that many of the families were experiencing. His relationship with Jesus Christ allowed him to know how to live in an unimaginable situation. When I think of a story like this, and I look at these words from the Apostle Paul, I've learned the secret of living in every situation. I realize this is real. Paul's not saying this to boast to us, to say, hey, I've achieved something, and look at me. He's saying, I've learned the secret of living in every situation, and so can you. Whatever your situation might be. And the secret to living in a situation that is unimaginable is not really a secret to us. For Paul says, I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. It's no surprise that Paul would say his relationship with Jesus Christ, something about that has given him the strength and the direction to know how to live no matter what the situation. Now let me remind you or inform you if you don't know, Paul didn't exactly live an easy life. He was shipwrecked, snake-bitten, imprisoned, beaten to an inch of his life more than once. Paul knew suffering, and he's saying, I know how to live in every situation. In other places, he talks about having joy in the midst of it. And if we're going somewhere, this is where we're trying to go. And if we want to lead somebody somewhere, we want to lead them to a growing relationship with Jesus Christ, because there is something about this relationship that gives you the strength to live your own life in a way that maximizes the joy that you have and helps you bring light out of darkness. So the question is your relationship growing with Jesus Christ? If you want to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, is it growing? And if it's growing, how would you know? How would you know that you're making progress on your journey? Now, the subtitle for this sermon series is A Roadmap for Faith. And the idea that we have here is that there's certain markers or landmarks that help you know that you're making progress on your journey. Just like you would look at a map and say, if we make it to here, and then here, and then here, we're getting closer to the ultimate destination. There's certain things that we can pay attention to that will help us know that our relationship with Jesus is growing and that we're developing that strength that will help us live no matter what life might bring to us. Last week we looked at servant leadership as one of those stops along the way. A servant leader is simply somebody who sees and does what needs to be done. They live like Jesus. Jesus was a leader, but he was a specific kind of leader, a servant leader. And a servant leader sees and does what needs to be done. They don't say, that's not my job, that's somebody else's responsibility, that's outside of my comfort zone. They look at a situation, they say, if I can do something about it, I'm just going to see it and I'm going to do it within my means. That's the spirit of Christ. If you're developing that in yourself, you're getting closer. You're developing your relationship with Jesus to be stronger. Today we're going to talk about intentional relationships. Next week we're going to talk about growing faithfulness. And these three are stops along the way. They are markers to help you know you're headed in the right direction. If these attitudes and behaviors start to manifest in your life, you know you're doing the right things. So today, intentional relationships. Intentional relationships are about inviting and investing in people. Inviting and investing in people. We've been doing that all summer with our Let's Go to Lunch campaign. Invite somebody out to lunch so you can invest in a relationship with them. It's simple but effective. So I want to get you thinking about relationships a little bit more. Because I know when I tell people to invite and invest in people, that for some of you, and for me included, my anxiety goes up a little bit. Because I'm thinking, I only have room for so many people in my life. Right? I only have room for so many people. You only have so many hours in a day. So are you saying, Pastor Scott, that I'm supposed to invite and invest somebody to lunch and then become their best friend and spend all my time with them? No, I'm not. Some of them maybe. You don't know what it might lead to. But we're going to look at how Jesus did relationship. But first, I want you to think about your childhood best friend. Get a picture in your mind of your childhood best friend. Think about what you would do with them. Maybe you went on walks with your childhood best friend. Went on journeys down through the neighborhood, wherever it might be. Maybe you went on rides with your childhood best friend. Maybe there weren't any kids in your neighborhood, so your childhood best friend was a dog. Maybe you took your shirt off as your childhood best friend and you went elbow deep into a pumpkin. But you did things with your childhood best friend. And I imagine that the way you became best friends with that person wasn't really difficult. My childhood best friend, Eric Ralph, lived across the street. That's why he was my best friend. Because he was right across the street. And that kid used to show up at my house before I even woke up saying, hey, what do you want to do today? It was easy to be best friends with Eric when we were little kids. But then we started to grow up. We started to grow apart. And Eric was a year older than me. He went off to high school and I was still in junior high. He started to make different friends. I started to make different friends. And before I knew it, I was kind of by myself, at least not in that close relationship. Now, a lot of us, as we get older, we find ourselves more and more isolated. And it's difficult. Why? Well, as we grow older, relationships, they just get more difficult. Life is more complex. Our needs are more complex. There's scheduling issues. It's just harder to be in relationship with other people. When you're a kid, it was easy. But as you grow up, it gets a little bit harder, doesn't it? And so there needs to be more intentionality about that. And there needs to be more thought put into how you're doing a relationship and to whom you're doing a relationship. And so what we're going to do today is just look at how Jesus did relationship. And that will help you be better at your relationships. The key idea is growing your relationship with Jesus. The more familiar you are with how he did things, how he saw things, how he acted, the more you grow your relationship with Jesus, the more your relationships with others will improve. So let's talk about relationships. And this part's a little teachy, okay? So forgive me for that. But relationships have different levels. And so if you look at this, I know there's a lot up there, but at the very top, you got the broadest spectrum. You got the public or the crowd level. The next is the social or the large group. This is a large group. The next is the private or the small group. That could be a group of neighbors, a group of good friends. It could be your community group. Then you have your intimate, your inner circle. Maybe your spouse, maybe your best friend, whoever that might be. And then there's the foundational relationship that empowers them all. Your relationship with the one, the creator of all things. So Jesus, at the public level, Jesus engaged the crowds that did not follow him. If you read the Gospels, everywhere Jesus went, there were crowds. And they were trying to get him to do things and get him to stay places, and they were trying to influence him, but they did not have his best intentions in mind. They were there for their needs. And Jesus engaged the crowds. He taught them. Occasionally, he met a stranger from the crowds that ended up becoming a follower and had some powerful interactions, but he did not follow the crowds. Now, you might be thinking, well, when I go to the store, or when I go to somewhere else, a crowd doesn't follow me, so this is irrelevant. However, in your life, there are crowds. I want you to think about the presence of social media in your life. As one example. Some of us are on Facebook. Some of you have like 100 friends, or 200 friends, or 500 friends. And, that's great. I'm not, putting that down because Jesus engaged us, so engage social media, engage Facebook. But don't follow it. I've already heard stories since I've been here about people who have gotten all bent out of shape and hurt by a message from somebody who's in that extended network of their friends. Why are you following what they have to say? You can engage it, but don't let that define you. Or here's another example of the crowd that is in your life. Did you know that on an average day, research says that you consume somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 commercial messages a day? In the modern era, the onslaught of advertising is so ubiquitous, so all-encompassing, we don't even notice it. Yet every one of those advertisements are trying to get you to think something about yourself, think something about the world, and they don't have your interests in mind. You can engage the advertisement, that's okay, some of it's fun. Don't follow it. Be intentional about how you engage the crowds. Getting a little bit smaller now, we have the social level. And one thing that a lot of us don't know is that Jesus not only had 12 disciples, but he had a larger group of disciples as well. So he had a large group that traveled with him and that worked alongside of him. In Luke 10, there's a story about Jesus selecting 72 disciples, and he sends them out 2 by 2 to do missionary work, to go spread the word. Jesus had a large group of people who were traveling with him and working alongside of him, doing that very work. And if he needed that size of a group, perhaps you need one too. And a church is that kind of group. A church is a group of people who you can travel with, who you can grow with, who are headed in the same direction as you. And they're a group of people who you can do ministry with. And there's something about that large group experience that is unreplaceable. Singing in the shower might be great for you, but singing together as a group also has a place in your life. Jesus had a large group. Get a little bit smaller, Jesus found a small group of 12 to invest and invite and invest in. He called out Peter and James and John. He developed himself a small group of people who he spent significant amounts of time with, who not only did he teach, but they also supported his work. The story of Jesus actually calling the 12 disciples, what happens right before that is he has a conflict with some of his adversaries. And it pains him deeply because he goes up into the mountains and prays for an entire night. And if you think about it, he's up there praying and saying, what should I do about this conflict in my life? And the application that God gives him is to go call the 12 disciples. Jesus needed a smaller group of people who were involved in his life, who knew him well, to both support him and work alongside him. That's what we're trying to do with community groups here at Faith. We did some in the spring, and we're going to start some again in October. And I know October might feel like a long time from now, but you can make a decision in your heart today to prioritize becoming part of a community group, to get your 12 or your 10 or whatever it is, but a small group of people who you intentionally meet with and develop like Jesus did. Jesus had an intimate level of relationships. Among those 12, he selected 3, Peter, James, and John, and he chose to share his most vulnerable moments with them. Peter, James, and John were selected to go up on the mountaintop and see Jesus as he became transfigured. Peter, James, and John were invited at Jesus' most intimate and vulnerable moment when he went off to pray right before he was arrested, and he was filled with despair and agony. And he invited these 3 to be with him there and support him. Who are your 3? It might be your spouse, it might be a sibling, it might be a child, but it could be a friend, but you need an inner group. At least Jesus did. And he did relationship on all these different levels, but he had three that he could turn to as vulnerable moments. Do you have the three? And then there was the final relationship that set it all up. But I want to take you to some scripture before I talk about that. So this is from Jesus' last night with his disciples, which is very significant to me because, if you think about what you would do on your last night, if you knew it was your last night, what you would teach and what you would think and who you would spend it with, this is what Jesus is doing. He's with his 12, and his inner circle, the three are there as well. And John writes, he had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and he loved them to the very end. So the people he loved most, he's going to love until the very last moment. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, that he had come from God, and that he would return to God. Let me pause right there. The stuff in yellow, the words in yellow. What that means, he had come from God, he would return to God, and Jesus knew it. Jesus knew the foundation of his identity. He knew exactly who he was. And knowing exactly who he was allowed him to engage in relationship in healthy and fruitful ways. And knowing exactly who he was and where he was from and where he was going and whose he was allowed him to do things that were unimaginable to other people. So Jesus got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that he had around him. It's easy to miss the power of this moment for us today because we don't have the context of washing people's feet. I mean, we did it once on here in the sanctuary. It was a little bit awkward and vulnerable, but I mean, in this day and age, that was definitely the work of a servant. It is not what a leader does. It was very intimate. It was very personal. It was so personal that Peter, one of the inner circle, said, "No way, Lord, you're not touching my feet." And that's how powerful this was. But Jesus was teaching an intentional lesson to the people he was intentionally with on his last night. He's saying, servant leadership, this is how low it will go. It goes to washing somebody's feet. It goes to doing the little tasks, the unthinkable tasks, the thing that you think you're above sort of things. Jesus was very intentional about how he did relationship. And it's because he had this foundational relationship with his Father in heaven. His devotion to the one gave him the strength to love everyone. He loved them while he was with them, and he loved them to the very end. Nothing was standing in the way. There was nothing Jesus wouldn't do. How did Jesus get this strength to do relationships so intentionally, to engage the crowds but not follow them, to walk along and travel with a large group of people, to call 12 to invest and invite in, to have 3 to really become vulnerable with? What was the source of this strong relationship with his Father that set every one of these other relationships up for him and that would set it up for you? The answer is Jesus prayed. I did some Bible study about Jesus praying. And here's what I learned. Early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus prayed. Late at night and all through the night, Jesus prayed. In public, in order to teach others, Jesus prayed. In private, to listen deeply to his Father, Jesus prayed. When he was tempted, Jesus prayed. When he was frightened, Jesus prayed. When he needed guidance, Jesus prayed. When he needed power, Jesus prayed. Before he healed the sick, what do you think he did? Jesus prayed. Before he fed the hungry, Jesus prayed. Before he called the 12, are we catching on yet? Come on now. We got a few more of these. Before he served the Last Supper, Jesus prayed. After they tried to make him king, Jesus prayed. After the 72 succeeded in ministry, Jesus prayed. After he was criticized and laughed at, Jesus prayed. After they betrayed him and nailed him to the cross, Jesus prayed. Jesus prayed for his enemies. Jesus prayed for the hurting. Jesus prayed for the children. Jesus prayed for the disciples. Jesus prayed for me. Jesus prayed for you. Look at what Jesus prayed. I'm praying not only for these disciples, but also for all who will ever believe in me through their message. That would be you. And I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one. As you are in me, Father, and I am in you. Jesus prayed that you would have the same kind of relationship with God, your Creator, the Father in heaven, as he did. That's what he wanted you. He wanted you to have that kind of relationship that sets up relationships at all the other levels of life. So you would know when to invite somebody into your inner circle, when you'd be able to let somebody go. So you would be able to be fruitful in a large group setting like a church, so you can find your community group, your small group, to journey with. Jesus prayed that you would have that kind of intimacy with God. He wants you to be intentional in your relationships. First and foremost, intentional in your relationship with your Father in heaven. So just like Jesus prayed, when you wake up, you can pray. When you go to bed, you can pray. Before you eat, you can pray. When you're driving, you can pray. When you see a loved one and you hug them, you can pray. You can pray at any moment in time, but your Father in heaven wants to be in relationship with you, wants you to be intentional. And do that, you will get the strength. You will get the guidance. You will be able to bring light out of your darkest moments. Jesus wants you to follow. Will you say yes? Will you say yes to this invitation to have this intimacy? It's theirs for you. But will you say yes? Please allow me to pray for all of you. Gracious Lord, there are some people here today. They've been looking for you, even though they didn't know they were looking. And they got relationships that are all over the board, and they're not sure what to do with them, but they want them to be healthy. They want them to be good. So God, I ask that they will say yes to following your Son, who taught us to pray to you, to be in communion with you, to trust you, to follow you. Will they follow, Lord? I pray that they would answer yes, knowing that you will lead them to good places, that you will give them the strength to live in every situation. So help them say yes today. That is what I pray.